He said it was just horrible. It was a horrible experience, and he says, and then there was this silent clapping of the hands 3 times, and Cockshaw had to knock out his post, and the trap fell, and the body swung, and stayed that way for about a half an hour, and then they cut them down, and put their bodies in those clothes, in those pine boxes, with a bottle with a note with their names, and buried them right there. They wouldn't remain there, but they were buried there that day. And you can kind of see the trap hanging there beside him. But anyway, you don't see Cockshaw in any of the post-assassination ones. Well, William Cockshaw returns to Wisconsin and lived for a little while in Oshkosh, and he sold livestock and was a butcher, and ended up being buried when he died. He's buried in Beaverdale. So Wisconsin has one of the 4 Lincoln assassination executioners, and it's right. All right, William Henry Noble. I love this guy. I wish I could talk to this guy. Born in 1837 in New York, he comes to Wisconsin, ends up enlisting in the Civil War. He was injured about, I think he enlisted in 1862, and about 2 months into his service, he was injured to the point where he could no longer fight, so he was sent to the same place Cockshaw was sent. And they were both there at the same time. And after Booth had left the city, and they were looking for the manhunt, Henry Noble and some of his group were handpicked to be in the posse. But then the orders changed, and they were assigned to be, he was anyway, one of only 21 people assigned to be Lincoln's pallbearer. Nobody but the pallbearers were allowed to touch or feel the casket. And so they were not part of the original 8 that did the funeral in the East Room. But the funeral that came after the East Room funeral, and for those that don't know, Lincoln had 12 public funerals. So once he left the White House, went to the Capitol, went to the train, and then he started this long 1,700-mile trek up through Philadelphia, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, all the way up to Albany, over to Buffalo, down to Cleveland, down to Columbus, then over to Indianapolis, then up to Chicago, and then down to Springfield. So it would be a 2-week funeral in the days of early embalming. Okay, Lincoln was our first embalmed president, because embalming had just become scientifically an art during the Civil War to get bodies back to families who might have been states away. And so there were embalming companies out on the battlefields with the soldiers. And Lincoln's son was embalmed in 1862 in the White House. And so Lincoln now is going to be embalmed. So they had this funeral car, became known as a funeral car. It was actually built for Lincoln to travel in. He never did travel in it. It had just been completed. And so you see, you know, the guard there standing there at the end, and these 3 down here. We don't know if Henry Noble's any one of them, but he was one of the 21 men that traveled on this train. And what was their job? Well, you can see there's multiple cars in this funeral train. So one car had the casket, and one car had all the soldiers sleeping in it. One was a dining car, you know. And then they had to have cars for the governors of the state that they were in and all that. So it was quite a pageant. Over the next 2 weeks, all of these cities had their own hearse. And so when they would read, well, did you see Philadelphia's hearse? Well, New York had to have a better looking hearse than Philadelphia. And who's going to top New York? And so there was this somewhat of an unspoken competition to see who would have the best hearse, who would have the best funeral, who would have the most novel funeral. And so you can see some of the hearses here. These are all different hearses. This is Philadelphia, and Lincoln's 6'6" casket. New York is up there with the 4. And here's a picture of New York. They're waiting for the hearse to come by in this age of photography. And then here it comes. Here it comes. Look at that hearse. And we don't know who those 4 men are, but there's 4 on the other side. So I have to assume that there's not a lot of records about what they did, but some had to stay with the train, some had to walk with the hearse. And sometimes they had to walk miles. And the crush of the crowd, you're talking about New York, 300,000 people coming out to see the hearse, 100,000 in Philadelphia. It got to the point where if the train was expected to arrive at this time, sometimes, very often, people were seen along the railroad tracks 5 to 10 miles out of town in lines waiting days before the train was meant to arrive. You had 1 second at the casket. So if you have 100,000 people waiting to see Lincoln and you don't have enough time, what do? Well, I'll tell you what the spectators in these towns did. There they remained until they saw the spot where he was displayed. They didn't leave because he was gone. He was already on the train going to the next town. There they remained in that line until they just saw the spot where his body laid. Here's New York. We take this photograph and we go straight up to that open window where those 2 little heads. One of those heads is Theodore Roosevelt, who saw the Lincoln funeral, as it were, or the procession. A lot of interesting stories come out of the New York funeral. It was in New York City Hall. You can just see all the people going up into New York City Hall. They had that big banner that said, "The nation mourns." And they were getting bored, and someone threw up a lit cigarette and lit it on fire, and the whole thing came down in a fiery tatter onto the crowd. That was one thing that happened. And then once you were in City Hall, you had to go down into these catacombs and march around like rats in a maze. Then you came up and you had to climb 22 stairs up to a top where you looked at Lincoln for 1 second. And then you had to go back down the 22 stairs to get out. The problem was, by this time, there was a few problems with organization. Nobody anticipated that women would want to start kissing him. The other problem was that people started wanting to put things in his casket, trinkets, mementos. And so they had to have somebody there always keeping the ladies from wanting to kiss the face and touch him and touch the casket or tear something off. And then there, in New York especially, it was, let's just do one more look. And you miss the first step and you have these avalanches now going down because somebody wanted one more look. I mean, it was just a disaster in New York. And you can see the choir below singing hymns while this is all going on. And then Jeremiah Gurney, and a photographer, was able to get way up in the rotunda, and he took that only known photograph of Lincoln. And another French artist, Pierre Morin, made several sketches of Lincoln in his casket. These are just different versions of it. He did a minor sketch, then he filled it in, and then we have the final one. But what you find with the Lincoln funeral is some people started looking at him in New York and thinking, oh my. Even embalmed because of the trauma of the head wound. You know, the eye is black. Sometimes they said he looked very shrunken in his 6'6" coffin. Some people said he looked unnatural. But he traveled with undertakers and embalmers on the train. And because of this constant touching and probing and kissing, they'd have to bring him back to the train, take him out of the casket, empty the casket of all the stuff, put him back in. They had a wardrobe for him with different shirts because they were getting dirty, and people just did not want to leave him alone. Here we are in Buffalo, more crowds. I'm going to watch my tie. Here's the hearse. Oh, I will tell you this story. This is a great story because it doesn't show me in the most favorable light, and people like it when the speaker doesn't look all that great. In 2015, they replicated Lincoln's funeral in Springfield. Spent 7 years planning it. 7 years. They replicated the funeral train, they replicated the casket, and they replicated the hearse. In fact, this hearse, replicated hearse on the right, and that's a photograph of the original, is still in a funeral home, owned by a funeral home in Springfield. The day of the funeral, replicated funeral, I was down there, I was to the right of the receiving vault, which is still there. And a few days before I went down there, I had said to my wife, I said, really a replicated funeral. And she says, yeah, and I said, and I know it's your birthday. She says, I forgive you. Let me go. So I was down there in a tree, actually, to the right of the receiving vault. And they finally brought Lincoln's body back. And he arrived in Oak Ridge Cemetery on May 4th, 1865. And this is the vault his body was put in. So it's about, 2 weeks later. And William Henry Noble and his people are dismissed. And William Henry Noble came back to Wisconsin where he was living. The car itself burned up in 1911 in a spectacular fire. And so that's no longer in existence. But Henry Noble came back to Wisconsin and was awarded, as was his other 20 comrades, what we would know today as the Congressional Medal of Honor. But then it was just known as the Medal of Honor. And they all were given Medals of Honor. And then years later, it had become somewhat of a polluted award because it was supposed to be given out for valor on the battlefield. That was the nature of the Medal of Honor. These people had not been in battle, and so the government came in and said, we have to do something with this, because the government started handing these Medals of Honor out like, they didn't have the same meaning that they had. So they went in and removed, I want to say like 900 names off the Medal of Honor list. And the Lincoln pallbearers were scratched as having been recipients of the Medal of Honor. But the government did not come and physically take their medals away, but you will no longer see them on the list. But Henry Noble always had his uniform and his Medal of Honor, kept it all those years. And I read a few years ago, I've not been able to track it down yet, but his uniform and his medal is somewhere up in this neighborhood. It's either in a historical society or it's in Ripon. I saw a Ripon newspaper where it was on display at one time. But if any of you know where William Henry Noble's Civil War, and I've seen pictures of it, I've seen pictures of the medal, but nobody can tell me where it is. You will really make my day if you call me up and tell me where William Henry Noble's uniform and medal is. And he is buried in Manitowoc. So we have not only an executioner, we have a pallbearer. All right. So those are the stories that I said I would talk about tonight. I just want to see if there's anything else. I got a few minutes just to talk about a couple of other ones that I think are maybe a little fascinating. This is Mary Lincoln when she went up on the boat cruise to the Great Lakes. This is the actual boat she went up on. They stopped in Milwaukee. Interesting story about Mary Lincoln is, of course, her husband's been dead for 2 years. And they stopped to take on supplies in Milwaukee from Chicago. And Tad Lincoln, the youngest remaining son, was with Mary. And he got off the boat. Mary stayed on the boat, but he got off the boat and went into the Milwaukee, well, I guess it'd be like Wall Street. He went into Milwaukee's Wall Street building. And the Chamber of Commerce people found out that Abraham Lincoln's 14-year-old son was in the building. And all of them came down, and they're standing around this little 15-year-old boy, staring at him. I mean, the whole nation knew about him. He's a little imp, always in trouble, And they're standing around, all these grown men, and they, we don't know what they asked him, but he did tell them that, well, thank you very much, nice to meet you. Yes, I was with my dad when I walked through the streets of burning Richmond, Virginia at the end of the war, held my dad's hand, we walked through the streets. And so you see the last photograph of him and Tad, February 5th, 1865, just a couple of months before he was killed. And there's a picture on the far right is a picture of Hal Holbrook playing Lincoln. And that's how they would have appeared, though, walking through the streets of Richmond, Virginia. But he was a celebrity in Milwaukee. That was as close as they could get to Lincoln, was by standing there and gazing at his son. But Tad Lincoln, like I said, was a little in, okay? He ultimately, by 1867, at this time, for being 14, even 15, was completely illiterate. So we think of Lincoln being the education president, maybe next to George Herbert Walker Bush, who wanted to be known as the education president. Lincoln's always been known to be pro-education, self-made man. Mary Lincoln, 7 years of formalized schooling, more than most women of her age. And then you have this boy who was completely illiterate. And his elder brother, Robert, became a very successful attorney, would be writing to people who requested autographs of the family. And he'd say, I can give you one of my dad, my mom, and me. I can't give you one of my brother Tad. He has not yet been able to sign his name. And we have in other books stories of how he could not even comprehend or spell three-letter words. And but he also hated school. He hated structure, hated discipline. Anything that resembled school, structure, discipline, rules. And so when he went to church on Sunday mornings, he went with his brother, who was actually going to be a preacher, the one that died in the White House, wanted to be a minister. They would go to church with two other boys and their sister. These 5 kids are in church, and they're all doing the proper church service. When you kneel, when you get up, when you pray, not Ted. He had knives. He'd be in the pew. And we've all been in church where you get out of the service thinking, I hope I never sit in front or in back of that kid again. That's the kid. He had knives. He carved into benches. They had pew doors on the pews. And he loved nothing better than slam the pew doors right in the middle of a sermon. He thought it was great when the ministers had these long prayers for his father, and he'd say to his brother, I just don't understand why they pray so long for Dad. I don't get it. Why do they have to pray so long for him? And then the people that were not necessarily pro-Lincoln, that were in the service, when they're praying for the president, would get out and slam the pew doors, and stomp out of the church because they were praying for Lincoln. Tad thought that was great. Slam the pew doors. So they got up into LaPointe, up in the Apostle Islands, and Tad went to some Catholic mass up there, as if Tad would know anything about a Catholic service. Whatever happened, because we found evidence that after the service, after the mass, the priest took Tad aside and scolded him for his lack of behavior in church. And here he's 15, still does not know how to act in church, and seemingly is uncontrolled. So we get a few little human interest stories out of that. Okay, I was told to be done by 7. I'm done. Done. So I got 5 minutes. I have books on the table. If you want one, feel free. I'll tell you this, they're on sale today for $25. The signature is free. I appreciate the library having 2 copies in their holdings here. I didn't know that. I'm very flattered by that. And I will take 5 minutes of questions if anybody has any questions about anything.
What do we know of Tad at the end?
What do we know of Tad at the end? Tad ended up going over to Europe with his mother in 1868, 3 years after the assassination. They always believed Tad had a speech impediment. They've never been able to identify what that was. But it was not a cleft palate, they know that. But he had some speech impediment of some kind. He went over to Europe. His mother took him to Europe. They fled the country. Robert was married, serving as an attorney in Chicago, and he ended up finding German doctors that could work with Tad and seemingly fix the speech problem. And he was over there for 3 years. Came back, he finally said, Mom, I want to go home and visit Brother Bob, because he now had a little niece he hadn't seen. He talked his mother into coming back. They came back. Everybody knew Mary Lincoln and Tad were coming back. The press is at the pier. And off comes Mary Lincoln, and off comes Master Tad. Well, now he's 18, and he's, thinned out. He's dressed in these beautiful suits. And the press sees him, and they say, Master Tad, so great to see you. Oh, yes, thank you very much. And they said, what's your plans? Well, he said to the New York press he thought he would be a physician. He wanted to be a doctor. And they said what was so cute about it was that he answered the questions very articulately with a German accent. And he only lived 3 more months and died in his mother's arms of tuberculosis in Chicago. He had fluid on the lungs, and they literally strapped him into to upright chairs during these coughing spasms. And one day she's sitting in front of him talking to him, and he just pitched forward and died.
Is that when her problems really came about?
Her problems preceded that, but Mary Lincoln's life is one of great tragedy, and she's a complex personality all her own. But looking at, imagine if your father, your grandmother, and your son all died in the same year, in 1850, and then her son died in 1862, then her husband died next to her, 1865, then Tad died 6 years later, 1871. She has nobody left but one son, in the course of 16 years. It's a real hard story to tell, really. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me in Princeton tonight. It's been enjoyable being here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. If people would like to come over and take a look at his book, or would like to purchase one, just go do that right now. And thank you.